At 11:14 PM local time on the 24th of October 2022, Singapore Airlines Flight 319 is on an approach at Batam International Airport, Indonesia. The tension is high. A mess of events has resulted in just minutes of fuel left in the tanks of the Boeing 777. As it descends to runway 04, it drifts high on the glide slope and left of the runway centre line. The first officer, flying the plane, pitches the nose down and turns to the right. He knows he needs to get this approach right or the aircraft could be in serious trouble. As the plane descends through 500, 400, now 300 feet above ground level, the vertical speed reaches 1400 feet per minute. Through 212 feet, an alarm sounds.
Sink rate, sink rate.
The ground proximity warning system indicates that the excessive sink rate is leading to an unstable descent. As per their company procedures, the first officer has to initiate a go-around. However, the fuel quantity is now at a critically low level. We don't know how much they have for sure, but it surely can't be enough to make it around for another instrument approach. The first officer, captain, and 278 other people on board are in serious danger. It was a series of unique and unfortunate events that led them to this situation, but a set of events which does reveal some holes in the modern day aviation safety system. So let's go back to earlier in the flight to see exactly how they got into this perilous situation. At about 10 PM local time on the 24th of October 2022, Singapore Airlines Flight 319 passes over Malaysia and turns south for Singapore. Singapore Approach Control informs the crew they can expect to land on runway 20 right at Changi Airport. They enter this clearance into the flight management computer, and it shows an estimated fuel on landing of 7,000 kilos, well above their final reserve requirement of 3,024. Singapore Changi is one of the largest transportation hubs in Asia for both passenger and cargo traffic. It has 3 runways and 4 terminals, and it's the hub for the flag carrier of the Republic of Singapore, Singapore Airlines, widely known as one of the world's best international airlines. Flight 319 is a scheduled flight from London Heathrow to Singapore Changi. The aircraft is a Boeing 777-300ER, and on board are 280 people. 4 minutes after receiving their runway assignment, Singapore Air Traffic Control instructs the flight to hold over PASPU, an upcoming waypoint, and informs all traffic to expect delays.
All traffic on approach frequency expect delays. Tailwind for 30 right is in excess of 10 knots.
The maximum tailwind the Boeing 777 can land with is 10 knots. Tailwinds are hazardous because they increase the ground speed that planes land at, and therefore the landing distance they require. Air traffic control has stopped landing so they can change the runway configuration to 02 left, allowing landings into the wind. As the crew look to the weather radar though, they see there's an intense weather system moving over not only Changi Airport, but Paya Lebar Air Base and Senai International Airport too. These are Flight 319's planned alternates. To understand the significance of this, we need to rewind again, all the way back to the hours before the flight. When the time in London approached Singapore 319's scheduled departure of 7:50 PM, the crew of 4 pilots would have arrived at Heathrow International Airport. It consisted of 2 captains and 2 first officers. One captain and first officer would be designated as the operating crew, flying the takeoff and landing, while the others would be the augmenting crew, taking the cockpit seats in the crews while the operating crew took their prescribed rest period. As they got to the airport, passed through customs and security, through to their aircraft, they would have finalised their fuel load. Fuel is clearly essential to the operation of aircraft. From takeoff to landing, it's the lifeblood keeping the plane in the air. But it's also a ticking time bomb. Exhausting it is more than a no-no. If the bomb goes off, you're in a situation survived by few. So keeping fuel, and therefore time in the tanks, is one of the prime objectives of aviation safety regulations. For Singapore 319, on top of the estimated flight fuel to Changi, several contingencies were also accounted for, including fuel to two designated alternates, Paya Lebar Air Base and Senai International Airport. So if anything happened at Changi, these two ports would still be available. On top of this were the standard legal requirements of reserve fuel, 45 minutes of fixed reserves plus 10% variable. The terminal aerodrome forecast for Changi indicated periods of light to moderate thunderstorm activity for more than 30 minutes but less than 60 minutes. Fuel reserves for this weather holding would be considered too, as well as taxi fuel and an instrument approach allowance. The flight crew accepted a fuel plan provided by the flight dispatcher with a total fuel of 106,164 kilos. They were satisfied they didn't need any more than this, as the en route weather looked clear, the forecast adverse weather at Changi was above their landing minima, the aircraft had no defects, and they were expecting track shortening through European airspace. As the events would unfold later in the flight, however, the pilots would be relying on every last drop and every last minute of their fuel.
All traffic on frequency, runway change to 02 left.
Singapore 319 is informed by air traffic control that the runway change is complete. The flight exits the hold after just one pattern and receives vectors towards runway 02 left. Just 6 minutes later, however, they're informed of deteriorating conditions at Changi.
There is currently heavy rain over Changi Airport, visibility 2 nautical miles reducing to 500 metres in heavy rain.
2 aircraft have performed go-arounds due to the poor visibility. There's also inclement weather along the approach paths, while the wind has shifted again back to the reciprocal direction. For these 3 reasons, Singapore Air Traffic Control Services decides to hold off all arriving traffic into Changi.
Singapore 319, expect a 5-minute delay. Further updates will be provided. For now, fly direct, SAMKO and hold.
Singapore 319 proceeds to the holding pattern to the south of Singapore and enters it. They're already in a perilous situation. The severe weather is covering not only Changi, but their 2 destination alternates, Paya Lebar and Senai. So en route to waypoint SAMKO, the flight crew obtained the weather for Batam Airport, which indicates clear conditions. We don't know exactly how much fuel is on board, but it must not be much, because the Singapore 319 flight crew inform air traffic control that they can only perform 1 hold at SAMKO before they're down to emergency fuel. As they enter the hold at 0833 UTC, ATC gives an update to all traffic on frequency.
All traffic on arrival frequency, visibility for 02 left has now deteriorated below 500 metres.
Things are clearly getting worse before they get better. The flight crew contemplate a diversion to Batam Airport where the weather is fine. Paya Lebar Air Base and Senai International Airport are still affected by the inclement weather. The aircraft is currently the same distance from Batam as it is from Changi, so a diversion at least wouldn't make the fuel situation any worse. Behind the scenes, Singapore Air Traffic Control informs Tanjung Pinang Approach Control in Indonesia that Singapore 319 might request a diversion to Batam, and they initiate coordination for the potential situation. At 0836, Singapore 319 passes over waypoint SAMKO once again. The captain requests an update on the situation from air traffic control.
Singapore 319, there is no update. Conditions have not changed.
Singapore 319, roger. We're only able to perform 1 more hold. If we don't receive clearance to commence an approach at Changi, we'll need to divert to Batam Airport.
Singapore 319, okay, we can help with coordination for that.
The Boeing 777 is about to complete its first holding pattern. According to their last radio call, they're about to be in an emergency fuel situation.
Singapore 319, approaching SAMKO.
Singapore 319, fly heading 180.
Heading 180, Singapore 319. Singapore 319, why are we being vectored away from Changi and Batam?
Singapore 319, Changi is unable to accept arrivals and we are still awaiting approval for your diversion to Batam Airport.
Singapore 319, we can make an orbit over SAMKO instead of a third hold.
Singapore 319, that's approved.
The environment in the cockpit is likely getting tense, with the diversion delayed by air traffic control. 3 other flights have already decided to divert to alternate airports.
Singapore 319, we need to divert to Batam Airport.
Singapore 319, that's acknowledged. Fly heading 180 for landing runway 22 at Batam Airport.
According to the final report on Singapore 319, the pilots have calculated that they can divert to Batam and land with their fixed reserve fuel intact, strangely contrary to a previous statement that the fuel requirement to Changi and to Batam was the same, and the pilots indicating they were emergency fuel. Nevertheless, a diversion to Batam makes sense. There's no certainty of landing at Changi, and the weather at Batam is clear. Before making a final commitment to the diversion, Singapore 319 makes one more query.
Singapore 319, is Changi Airport accepting arrivals yet?
Singapore 319, Changi is still not accepting arrivals.
The diversion decision is made, but the approval from Indonesia is still pending. Air traffic control vectors Singapore 319 towards the boundary of its control area, recognizing the tight fuel state of the Boeing 777. Their intention is to get it as close as possible to runway 22 in readiness for the handoff.
Singapore 319 is minimum fuel.
Finally, without doubt, we have a confirmed fuel state of Singapore 319. The minimum fuel radio call is legally required when any more holding will cause an aircraft to land below fixed reserves, meaning, at the moment, the pilots expect to land with just 45 minutes worth of fuel in the tanks. The report on Singapore 319 doesn't state any specific fuel levels, but we'll keep an estimate of their fuel margin for the rest of the flight, because the ordeal of Singapore 319 is far from over.
Singapore 319, your clearance to Batam is still pending.
With the clearance pending and no landing time assured, the pilots are required to declare an emergency.
Roger. Singapore 319, now Mayday fuel.
The estimated fuel on landing is now below the fixed reserves, thus the requirement to declare a Mayday. This prompts air traffic control to turn Singapore 319 northbound for an approach, and finally transfer them to Indonesia air traffic control.
Tanjung Penang approach Singapore 319.
Singapore 319, approach. You have priority for landing.
The pilots hastily readied the aircraft computers and systems for an approach to runway 22. They intercept the approach path for runway 22 at 0900 UTC.
Singapore 319, there is a tailwind of 14 knots gusting up to 30 knots for runway 22.
Singapore 319, roger.
Tailwinds again have squandered an approach. The crew elect to discontinue it and reposition for a landing on runway 04. They maneuver the aircraft around building inclement weather. In the time it took for Singapore 319 to decide on a diversion from Changi to Batam, the storm system has moved as well. It's the cause of the changing wind direction, and it's going to create further problems for the pilots. They set the aircraft up for an auto land on runway 04 using the instrument landing system. And at 0905, Singapore 319 finally has a stroke of luck.
Singapore 319, runway 04 in sight.
Singapore 319, roger. Contact the tower frequency 118.7.
With the runway visually in sight, the first officer, flying the plane, turns off the autopilot and manually flies onto the localizer and glide slope. still with the intention of performing an autoland. However, the approach chart nor the company manuals indicate a pertinent piece of information. An autopilot limitation does not allow an autoland when the approach course is offset from the runway direction. For runway 04, the offset is just 1 degree, but it still means that the autopilot doesn't have the ability to land the plane itself. A minor inconvenience, given that the runway is inside anyway, but one that the pilots aren't expecting after not recognizing the offset in their rush to prepare for the approach. As the first officer positions the aircraft onto the approach course for runway 04, he re-engages the autopilot, expecting it to fly all the way to the landing. However, as he does so, a no auto land message appears in front of him. Startled, with the message not meeting his expectations and seeing almost full-scale deflections on the localizer and glide slope, he disengages the autopilot once again and executes a go-around from 132 feet. The crew have been so busy they never had time to get in contact with the tower, but they see the go-around and inform approach control just as Singapore 319 checks back in.
Singapore 319, going around.
Singapore 319, roger. Cleared to reposition as required for runway 04.
What's the tailwind for runway 22?
Singapore 319, standby.
Air traffic control comes back with the news of deteriorating conditions. Visibility is reducing to 500 meters for runway 04, with the wind now mostly a crosswind, 340 at 7 knots.
We don't have sufficient fuel for runway 22. We need the next attempt to runway 04 to be successful.
Singapore 319, visibility for runway 04 is now 800 meters. Continue the approach at your discretion.
We'll land runway 04.
The Indonesian approach controller and the tower controller, recognizing the now dire situation, coordinate to move all other traffic out of the way of Singapore 319 and keep the runway clear. As Singapore 319 breaks out of the cloud this time, for their third attempt at an approach into Batam, they're above the glide slope and offset from the runway centerline. The first officer pitches down and turns right, but the ground proximity warning system, a system built into all airliners to mitigate against controlled flight into terrain, isn't happy with the 1400 feet per minute descent rate so close to the ground. It generates an alarming warning.
Sink rate, sink rate, sink rate, sink rate.
A sink rate warning would be the last thing the pilots would want to hear on this critical approach. But it sounds to warn the crew that the aircraft is in an unsafe state. They're trained to always, no matter what, go around in this situation. So they do.
Singapore 319 going around. We're performing a teardrop for a visual landing on runway 22.
Singapore 319, roger. Wind is 330 at 15 knots.
A teardrop is a term used to reciprocate the current heading of an aircraft. The wind information provided by air traffic control is a tailwind for runway 22, but the pilots need to get the aircraft on the ground. The fuel has reached a critically low level, and if it completely runs out, the Boeing 777 will be in immediate and immense danger. We don't know much about what occurred in the last moments of Singapore 319, as the accident report simply states that the aircraft subsequently touched down on runway 22. A factual statement, but one which blows past what would have been one of the most tense moments of the four pilots' careers. They do end up landing safely in Batam, however, and they taxi to the bay, with the passengers not exactly seeing what they would have expected out of the side windows. A Mayday fuel situation is required to be reported to the relevant investigative authorities, so that all factors that contributed to it can be accounted for. Singapore's Ministry of Transport didn't exactly state how much fuel was on board Singapore 319 as it shut down at the gate, but we know it must have literally been just minutes worth. The hazardous but forecast weather over Changi generated a delay for the Boeing 777, which ended up requiring a diversion. But the time it took to decide upon and action the diversion to Batam Airport meant that the very same weather had time to move across and affect the flight once again. The unsuccessful approaches which resulted, caused partly by the weather and contributed to by what would have been a crew working to their limit, meant the Singapore 319 penetrated almost every single safety barrier in modern day aviation. Fortunately, some active and creative decision making by the crew in the flight's final moments allowed for a safe landing. With the flight so close to ending in disaster though, safety actions were made by Singapore Airlines before the report on the incident was even released. It conducted sharing sessions with its pilot group to promote active communication and recognition of high workload situations, and even incorporated it into its simulator recurrent program for pilots, while it initiated a review into all contents of airport briefing documents to ensure consistency on the level of details. It was a set of safety actions so comprehensive that the Ministry of Transport didn't have anything to add in its safety recommendations section of the final report. When it comes down to it, there's a common saying said across all levels of aviation. There's no use in runway behind you, sky above you, or fuel left in the bowser, because you never know when you'll need every last drop, as Singapore 319 required after a nightmare set of events. Fortunately for the 280 people on board, it was just enough to allow them to land safely.